After my son died, I kept a secret from my daughter-in-law. A secret that could change everything she thought she owned. On the day my son died, I didn't cry immediately. I couldn't. I stood frozen in the middle of his empty apartment, staring at the half-packed suitcase he had left behind, as if by looking long enough, he might appear, smiling that same stubborn grin he always had. My name is Eleanor Mason, I'm 50, and I had spent the last 25 years raising my family, running a modest interior design business, and quietly dreaming of a life that felt more mine than everyone else's. I never imagined that one single moment, one brutal, unthinkable moment, would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and family. My son, David, was 32, married to Sophie, a young woman whose charm was enough to disarm anyone, and yet beneath that charm, I had glimpsed something calculating. Sophie always had this way of smiling too sweetly, of tilting her head as if she were weighing every word, every movement, and deciding whether it would serve her or someone else. At first, I tried to ignore it. She's family now, I whispered to myself, just give it time. But now, standing in David's empty apartment, I felt the first pang of unease sharpen into something darker. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. David had always been meticulous, he left sticky notes everywhere, a habit that had once annoyed me but now made me ache. One note on the kitchen counter reads simply, "Mom, everything is in order. Take care of yourself." My chest tightened. He had left me more than words. I remembered, as I sifted through the paperwork on his desk, the deeds, the titles, the financial statements. David had entrusted me with something enormous, a house, 2 luxury cars, and investments I couldn't even begin to count. My hands trembled as I realized the magnitude of what was in my control now, and the dangerous secret I would have to keep from Sophie. For years, my life had been ordinary. I had mornings filled with clients who wanted their homes transformed into cozy sanctuaries, afternoons spent in quiet coffee shops scribbling designs, and evenings with David, sharing stories of the day. Everything had seemed so stable. Until now. Now, the world had shifted. A weighty silence had descended over me, punctuated by the echo of my son's absence. And I knew, once I kept this secret from Sophie, nothing would ever be the same. Sophie had been polite, always smiling, always pleasant when she visited. But her eyes betrayed impatience, greed hidden beneath layers of civility. She had that way of leaning just a little too close when she asked for details, as if trying to probe for weaknesses. I remembered the subtle hints, the way she casually mentioned wanting to upgrade her lifestyle, or how she seemed overly interested in David's financial choices. At the time, I shrugged it off, telling myself, she's just excited about the future, that's all. But now, alone in David's apartment, I understood that those tiny seeds of ambition could grow into something far more dangerous than I had imagined. Before David's death, life had its small joys. My small home studio was thriving, and I had started a modest collection of paintings and antiques, things I loved more for the stories they held than for their monetary value. Friends came and went, and family gatherings were filled with laughter and the usual tensions, but they felt manageable. I had a life I could navigate. And yet, standing here now, holding the keys to everything David had left behind, I realized that the calm I had known was a fragile illusion. And so, I made a choice, one that would define the coming months, and perhaps even years. I decided, quietly and firmly, that Sophie would never know the full extent of what David had left me. Not yet. She was young, impulsive, and I could already see how easily she might make the wrong decisions if she had access to these assets. My mind raced through the possibilities, weighing the risks, imagining the conflicts. This was not just about property or money, it was about survival, about control, about proving that I was not merely a grieving mother, but a woman capable of protecting what was rightfully hers. And yet, beneath that calculated exterior, I felt the first sharp pangs of doubt. Could I really hide this from Sophie? Would it be cruel, or just prudent? The apartment seemed to close in around me as I pondered these questions. I wandered from room to room, lingering on the objects David had loved, his guitar leaning against the wall, the half-finished jigsaw puzzle on the table, the books he'd never finished reading. Each item was a fragment of him, a reminder of the man who had trusted me completely. As night fell, the city lights casting long shadows across the apartment floor, I made a vow to myself, I would protect what David had entrusted to me. Not out of malice, not out of greed, but because I knew that some secrets, some treasures, were too precious to reveal too soon. And deep down, I sensed that Sophie's charm, her smiles, her calculated politeness, would not withstand the storm that was quietly gathering on the horizon. I didn't know it then, but this decision, to keep the inheritance a secret, would set in motion a series of events more shocking, more emotional, and more dramatic than anything I could have imagined. Betrayal, deceit, manipulation, and ultimately, revenge. The quiet life I had taken for granted was gone. The game had begun. The morning after I returned David's apartment keys to my own home, I felt a restless energy I couldn't shake. The grief still weighed heavily, but there was a sharper edge now, one born from anticipation and suspicion. Sophie called that afternoon. Her voice was bright, too bright, almost rehearsed. "Mom, I was thinking," she began, hesitating as if searching for the perfect words. "Maybe we could look over David's things together? Just to, make sure everything's in order?" I felt a cold tightening in my chest. I smiled politely, keeping my voice soft. "Of course, Sophie. But I think I'll handle most of it for now. I want to make sure nothing gets misplaced." There was a pause on the other end. I could hear her inhale slowly, and in that silence, I realized something crucial. Sophie had already started weighing her options. She wasn't just curious, she was calculating. Over the next few days, I noticed small, subtle actions from her that set off warning bells. She asked to borrow documents just to understand the estate better, lingered a little too long in rooms that contained David's personal items, and made casual remarks about her plans for the house. At first, I tried to dismiss them. She's grieving too, I told myself. She just wants to feel included. But the unease grew. Sophie's helpfulness always seemed to come with a hidden edge. She offered to manage David's car collection, citing her experience with luxury vehicles, but her eyes gleamed in a way that suggested she was imagining herself behind the wheel of each one. She asked innocuous questions about bank accounts, investments, and insurance policies, phrased as curiosity, but each question felt like a probe, a test to see how much I might reveal under pressure. One afternoon, she arrived unannounced at my home studio, claiming she wanted to see some of David's favorite designs I had preserved for him. I remember that moment clearly. Her gaze swept across the room, scanning sketches, swatches, and invoices, and I caught a flicker of something almost predatory in her eyes. "I just want to honor his memory," she said softly, her tone dripping with sweetness. Yet the way she lingered on the most valuable pieces, the ones I had quietly set aside for myself, made my stomach knot. I nodded and smiled, carefully guiding her away from certain documents. It wasn't long before subtle manipulations began to surface. Friends who had once been neutral started commenting on Sophie's behavior, hinting that she seemed very keen on David's belongings. One of my colleagues, unaware of the full story, asked if I had considered dividing the inheritance equally. Sophie herself casually mentioned that she wanted to sell the house for something smaller and more manageable, planting seeds in conversations that could easily reach other family members. Each interaction left me both furious and cautious. I didn't want to confront her directly, not yet. I needed more evidence, more certainty that she couldn't be trusted. And at the same time, I had to maintain the facade of a grieving mother who was handling things properly. The tension was suffocating, but it sharpened my instincts. Then came the first unmistakable warning sign. I had received an anonymous tip, just a brief, cryptic email, that someone had seen Sophie in a car dealership, test driving a luxury model that was on David's insurance plan. My heart pounded. She wasn't just curious anymore, she was taking steps to claim what didn't belong to her. The following week, Sophie's behavior escalated further. She began inviting herself to meetings with lawyers and financial advisors, always insisting she was just helping to sort things out. Each time, I had to subtly redirect the conversation, withholding details about certain properties, accounts, and investments. But her eyes betrayed impatience. I caught glimpses of calculation behind that sweet smile. Every word, every question, was a step toward something larger, something I wasn't ready to let happen. I also noticed her manipulating family members. She whispered to David's younger cousins about how much Mom must have of the inheritance, casting doubts and stirring curiosity. Friends began offering unsolicited advice, suggesting she might have a rightful claim to certain assets. Sophie's charm was working, and some people were falling into her trap. It became clear that Sophie had underestimated one thing: me. I wasn't the type to let greed or charm sway my judgment. Every small test she devised, every attempt to push boundaries, I observed and catalogued. I recorded details, made notes, and began to anticipate her moves. I couldn't allow her to destabilize what David had trusted me to protect. And yet, I had to play the part of the accommodating mother, the grieving in-law who was trying to be fair. Each smile I offered her, each polite nod, was a mask hiding a brewing storm. The tension between us grew like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. The first tangible conflict came when Sophie demanded to see the deeds for David's properties, casually implying she would handle the legal process herself if I didn't provide them. I felt a jolt of anger, but I controlled my response. "I think it's best if we review everything together at a later time," I said calmly, hiding the fury that bubbled beneath. "For now, I need to ensure everything is in order before sharing any documents." Her smile faltered for the first time, just slightly. That flicker, however brief, was enough to confirm my suspicions. She was not just ambitious, she was reckless. She assumed she could push, prod, and eventually claim control. But I wasn't about to let that happen. By the end of the week, the subtle battle lines had been drawn. Sophie tested my patience, I tightened my defenses, and the quiet unease of grief became laced with a sharper, more thrilling tension. Every interaction was a careful dance, a test of patience, of strategy, and of will. The stakes were high: David's legacy, his home, his possessions, his dreams, they were all at risk, and I had to remain vigilant. And then, one evening, as I reviewed some old financial statements in David's study, I found a small error, an overlooked transfer, a tiny mistake in one of the investment accounts. It was insignificant in value, almost laughable, yet it was enough. Enough to give me the first glimmer of an idea. That evening, as the city lights flickered through the curtains, I realized something crucial: Sophie had underestimated me. She didn't see the storm brewing behind my quiet grief. And in that quiet, calculated moment, I felt the first flicker of anticipation for what was to come. This was no longer just about grief. It was about strategy, about protection, and, eventually, about revenge. The chessboard was set, the pieces were moving, and the game had only just begun. The morning started like any other, with the sun filtering through the curtains and Eleanor Mason nursing her coffee, trying to steady her nerves. But that fragile calm shattered in seconds. An urgent call from her lawyer pierced the quiet. "Eleanor, you need to come in immediately," the voice on the line said, tense and clipped. "There's been a massive withdrawal from David's accounts. And Sophie's name is all over it." Eleanor felt her heart lurch. She dropped the cup, watching it shatter on the floor, the hot coffee burning her fingers. "No, it can't be real," she whispered, disbelief coursing through her veins. But as the lawyer explained, detailing transactions she hadn't authorized, transfers of hundreds of thousands, luxury purchases, and even early withdrawals from property funds, reality hit like a thunderclap. Sophie had crossed the line. She wasn't just probing, she was acting, boldly, recklessly, and brazenly. Eleanor's mind raced. The house, the cars, the investments, all the things David had entrusted to her care, were suddenly at risk of being stolen in broad daylight. Her body trembled, a mixture of rage and helplessness overtaking her. She had seen the warning signs, but nothing could have prepared her for the audacity of this betrayal. She drove to the law firm, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Each red traffic light felt like a countdown to disaster. Inside, the lawyer laid out the evidence: bank statements, transaction histories, signed receipts. Sophie had attempted to liquidate 2 of David's cars, and had even spoken to real estate agents under the pretense of selling the house for family convenience. Eleanor's hands shook as she leafed through the documents. Her grief transformed into searing anger. How dare she? How dare she touch what belonged to David, what he trusted me to protect? The betrayal cut deeper than David's death itself. And yet, even in this storm of shock and rage, a small glimmer of clarity emerged. While reviewing the financial transfers, Eleanor noticed an irregularity, a minor error Sophie had made. A payment had been accidentally routed through a personal account in a way that left a tiny, traceable footprint. It was insignificant in the grand scheme of the theft, but it was enough. Enough to show a pattern, enough to track her actions, enough to plan for retribution. The emotional turmoil didn't stop at finances. Eleanor faced subtle social pressures as well. Family members, uninformed about the full story, began suggesting Sophie had a right to inherit her husband's things. Friends whispered doubts, implying Eleanor might be overreacting. Even a few colleagues, innocently curious, asked if she was sure she was handling the estate fairly. The pressure compounded, each word like a weight pressing on her chest. That night, Eleanor sat alone in the darkened living room, the quiet broken only by the hum of the city outside. Tears threatened, but she held them back. She couldn't afford the luxury of despair. Not now. Her mind raced with scenarios, legal actions, confrontations, ways to safeguard the house, the cars, and the investments. Each idea was tinged with fury, each possibility a step closer to reclaiming what was rightfully hers. But what truly ignited her resolve was a small, overlooked detail in Sophie's string of transactions, a pattern so careless it was almost laughable. Sophie had signed for a luxury car in her own name while claiming it was for David, leaving digital records that were easily traceable. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. This was the opening she had been waiting for, the first real mistake that could unravel Sophie's plan. For the first time since David's death, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. She realized that Sophie, for all her charm and cunning, was not infallible. She had left herself exposed, and Eleanor could exploit that exposure. The thought of turning the tables, of taking control from the person who had tried to usurp everything she loved, filled Eleanor with a bittersweet thrill. That night, Eleanor began to quietly organize a strategy. She listed every irregularity, every unauthorized transaction, every moment Sophie had overstepped boundaries. She reviewed bank statements, car registrations, and property documents, connecting dots that no one else seemed to notice. Each piece of evidence became a brick in a wall of impending justice she was determined to erect. Even in her darkest grief, Eleanor felt the sharp, invigorating taste of power return. She would not be passive. She would not allow Sophie to rewrite David's legacy for selfish gain. The betrayal had been profound, the shock crushing, but the seeds of retaliation were planted. And then, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she found herself smiling faintly for the first time in weeks. Not for joy, not for relief, but for anticipation. The first step had been discovered. Sophie's arrogance had given her a thread to pull, a flaw to exploit. It was small, almost insignificant, but in Eleanor's hands, it would grow into something formidable. By the end of that night, Eleanor knew one thing with certainty: Sophie had underestimated her. She had underestimated a grieving mother's resolve, a woman who would not only protect her son's legacy but also orchestrate a reckoning that Sophie would never see coming. The stage was set. The players were in position. And the storm, Eleanor realized, was only just beginning. The morning sun spilled into Eleanor's study, casting long shadows over the meticulously organized papers on her desk. She took a deep breath, feeling a surge of determination she hadn't known in weeks. The shock of Sophie's betrayal had passed, now it was time for action. Every document, every bank statement, every record of Sophie's unauthorized transactions had been carefully examined and catalogued. Eleanor had created a map of Sophie's missteps, tracing every purchase, every attempt to manipulate accounts, and every subtle lie she had told to family members. It was painstaking work, but Eleanor thrived on precision. The chessboard was set, and she was ready to make her move. Her first step was subtle, almost invisible. She contacted the banks and car dealerships involved in Sophie's unauthorized transactions, ensuring freezes were placed on the accounts and assets, quietly reclaiming control without alerting Sophie. Then she dug deeper, uncovering further evidence of Sophie's attempts to manipulate legal documents, falsify signatures, and even persuade friends to act as witnesses in schemes that would have given her partial control over David's estate. Eleanor smiled faintly, savoring the irony. Sophie had been so confident, so sure that her charm and deceit could outmaneuver a grieving mother. But she had left traces, careless mistakes that were Eleanor's key to turning the tables. The next phase required courage and confrontation. Eleanor invited Sophie over for what appeared to be a casual lunch, carefully choosing a neutral setting that suggested civility and calm. Sophie arrived, radiant and self-assured, unaware of the trap being quietly set around her. "Mom, I brought some paperwork," Sophie said, her voice sweet but edged with expectation. "I thought we could go over it together." Eleanor's smile was calm, almost serene. "Of course, Sophie. Let's sit down." As they settled at the table, Eleanor opened her laptop, displaying detailed charts and records of every unauthorized transaction Sophie had attempted. She spoke softly, almost conversationally, recounting events as if telling a story, yet every word cut with precision. "You may have thought these actions would go unnoticed," Eleanor said, her eyes meeting Sophie's. "But every car, every property, every transfer is documented. And every single attempt to take control of David's assets is visible, not just to me, but to the authorities who will be reviewing this." Sophie's smile faltered. A flicker of panic crossed her eyes, barely concealed behind forced calm. Eleanor pressed on, methodically revealing the evidence, piece by piece, showing Sophie's errors, her manipulations, and her careless oversights. "You thought you could charm everyone," Eleanor said, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of grief and fury. "You underestimated me, and you overestimated how far your tricks would go." By the time Eleanor finished, Sophie's confidence had crumbled. Her cheeks were pale, her hands fidgeting. Eleanor didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of proof, carefully laid out and undeniable, was enough to strip Sophie of control. And then came the final blow. Eleanor revealed the traceable digital footprint left by Sophie's signature on the luxury car purchase, a mistake so glaringly obvious that even Sophie could not deny it. It was more than evidence, it was a statement. Eleanor had seen through every scheme, every plan, and every attempt at deception. Sophie sat frozen, the mask of charm and poise shattered. Eleanor leaned back, savoring the quiet triumph that filled the room. She had regained control, and more than that, she had asserted herself in a way that left no room for argument. The aftermath was swift. Sophie left, her plans thwarted, her arrogance undone. Family members who had been subtly swayed by her whispers began to recognize the truth. Eleanor was not only the rightful guardian of David's legacy but also a force to be reckoned with. The house, the cars, and the investments remained secure, now shielded by both legality and Eleanor's vigilance. Eleanor allowed herself a private moment of satisfaction. She had not only protected what belonged to David, but she had also reclaimed a sense of agency that grief had nearly stolen from her. Every calculated move, every careful observation, every small act of preparation had led to this moment of triumph. Yet, beneath the relief and the victory, Eleanor sensed that the story was not fully concluded. Sophie had been beaten at this stage, yes, but Eleanor knew that true security required constant vigilance. The world was unpredictable, and those who sought to manipulate it often returned with new tactics. Still, for the first time since David's death, Eleanor felt a lightness she had not known in months. She could breathe without the constant gnawing anxiety that someone would take what she had fought so hard to protect. The storm had been weathered, and she had emerged stronger, sharper, and more confident. In the quiet that followed, Eleanor reflected on the lessons of the past weeks, the danger of underestimating those who appear sweet but are cunning, the power of patience and observation, and the satisfaction of turning grief and betrayal into calculated justice. She knew she would never be passive again. The house, the cars, the investments, David's legacy, were safe. Sophie had been exposed, humiliated, and stripped of her manipulative power. And yet, Eleanor understood that this was not the end, merely a pivotal chapter. She would continue to guard her son's memory, his possessions, and the respect he deserved, knowing that the line between vigilance and vengeance was delicate but essential. As the sun set that evening, casting golden light across her home, Eleanor allowed herself a small, victorious smile. She had played the game, and she had won. But the embers of caution still glowed softly in her mind, a reminder that life, like Sophie's schemes, could shift in an instant. For now, however, the board was hers. The pieces were aligned, and the path forward was clear. The quiet, calculated satisfaction of reclaiming control was sweeter than she had imagined, and Eleanor felt the thrill of justice mingled with the bittersweet ache of loss. She had survived the storm, exposed the treachery, and secured what mattered most. And in that triumph, Eleanor realized a powerful truth: sometimes, the greatest victories are born from the depths of grief and the clarity of purpose that follows. The weeks that followed were a mixture of relief and reflection for Eleanor Mason. Sophie had retreated into silence, her schemes exposed and her power stripped away, but Eleanor knew the battle was more than legal, it was emotional, psychological, and personal. Each day she reviewed the remaining documents, ensured the properties and investments were securely managed, and quietly rebuilt her life around a sense of stability she hadn't felt in months. For the first time since David's death, Eleanor allowed herself to breathe without the gnawing fear that someone might take what she had fought so hard to protect. The house, the cars, the accounts, all David's legacy, were safe, and she had learned to navigate the complex world of manipulation, deceit, and ambition. But more importantly, Eleanor realized that protecting material wealth was only part of the journey. She had also safeguarded her dignity, her pride, and her emotional resilience. Family gatherings became less tense, though Eleanor noticed Sophie's absence was palpable. Some relatives quietly expressed surprise at how Eleanor had handled the situation, acknowledging that they had underestimated her strength. Eleanor smiled politely, hiding the satisfaction that bubbled beneath her composed exterior. She didn't need accolades, the quiet triumph was its own reward. Yet life wasn't completely serene. Eleanor grappled with grief that lingered like a shadow at the edges of her days. Memories of David surfaced in unexpected moments, the echo of his laughter in the hallway, the half-finished puzzle left in his apartment, the subtle notes he had left behind. But now, instead of feeling crushed by these reminders, Eleanor felt a deep sense of purpose. She had honored his memory, protected his legacy, and reclaimed a sense of agency that grief had once threatened to steal. Her personal life slowly began to bloom again. She returned to her interior design projects with renewed energy, exploring opportunities that she had once set aside. The house, now fully hers, became a sanctuary where she could think, plan, and breathe. The cars, symbols of both David's love for luxury and the trials she had endured, stood as a reminder that vigilance and patience could turn betrayal into empowerment. And the investments, carefully managed, promised not just financial security but the freedom to live life on her own terms. The most profound change, however, was in Eleanor herself. She had learned that grief could be a teacher, that loss could sharpen instincts, and that betrayal could illuminate hidden strengths. The months of tension, fear, and strategic planning had transformed her, revealing a resilience she hadn't fully recognized in herself. She had navigated the storm, turned the tide, and emerged not just victorious, but stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. In quiet moments, Eleanor reflected on the lessons she had learned. She understood now that family could be unpredictable, that charm could mask greed, and that trust was both precious and fragile. But she also discovered that strategic patience, careful observation, and unwavering self-respect could protect what mattered most. And yet, Eleanor didn't close herself off entirely. She knew life was unpredictable, and that the future might bring new challenges, new opportunities, and even new conflicts. The experience had taught her that control was a delicate balance, one that required vigilance, intelligence, and emotional clarity. On a warm afternoon, Eleanor stood on the balcony of the house David had left her, the city stretching out below, bathed in golden light. She traced her fingers along the railing, her thoughts drifting over the months of grief, anger, and careful planning. She had survived the storm. She had reclaimed what was hers. And she had done so with a sense of poise and authority that made her feel invincible. The cars gleamed in the driveway, polished and pristine, symbols of victory. The house was secure, filled with the quiet echoes of memories and the promise of new beginnings. The investments continued to grow steadily, a tangible reminder that careful planning and perseverance paid off. Eleanor felt a thrill of satisfaction mingled with bittersweet remembrance, a combination of grief, triumph, and liberation that only someone who had endured betrayal could truly understand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the walls, Eleanor allowed herself a small, private smile. The game had been won, but the story was far from over. There was power in what she had preserved, in the life she had reconstructed, and in the lessons she now carried with her. The future remained uncertain, yes, but Eleanor faced it with strength, strategy, and a sense of justice that no one could undermine. In that moment, she understood something vital. Sometimes, the greatest inheritance is not just property, wealth, or material possessions. It is the clarity of mind, the depth of resilience, and the courage to act decisively when everything else is in chaos. Eleanor had learned that, and she would carry it forward. And as she whispered a quiet vow to herself, Eleanor knew that her story was far from finished. Sophie had been defeated, but the potential for new challenges lingered on the horizon, a subtle reminder that vigilance was eternal. Yet Eleanor was ready. She had claimed her power, honored her son, and secured her future. The rest was merely waiting to unfold. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I've protected what you trusted me with. And I'll continue to do so. No matter what comes next." The house, the cars, the investments, they were hers, yet they were also a testament to endurance, cunning, and love. The story ended not with closure, but with a sense of readiness, of power reclaimed, and of a life that Eleanor could now live fully, wisely, and fiercely. And for anyone listening, anyone who might ever face betrayal, Eleanor's message was clear: grief can make you vulnerable, but strategy, patience, and courage can turn loss into your greatest triumph.